Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is indeed one of the most subversive films ever made. But it's not because of what you think. It's not because it's on the surface woke and because there is some gender swapping and race swapping, etc. going on. That's not because it's subversive. It's subversive because the movie tells a completely different story than Homer's The Odyssey. And it does so because it Christianizes the story. In fact, it imports Judeo-Christian ethics into the Odyssey, which is simply not there. And it's in the subtitle, the tagline, the keynote of the film, of the movie itself, which is Defy the Gods, uttered no less by Odysseus himself. So I'd like to go over some notes on why the Odyssey is such a subversive movie and why it would have been better not to be made at all. But this also includes why, of course, this movie is such a favorite of American conservative pundits. It is precisely because what they have seen in it is that it is a Trojan horse for Judeo-Christian values and ethics. So let's look at the context in which Odysseus utters the words, "I will defy the gods." Athena, who is not really a divine, glorious presence, but is his bad conscience throughout the movie, appears to Odysseus in a vision, utterly un-Greek by the way, to warn him that Zeus and the Olympian gods have turned against him and will not grant him and his dwindling crew safe passage home to Ithaca. Now that is, of course, that spits in the face, if you've read the Odyssey, of what Homer wants to tell us. In fact, Odysseus is the darling of the gods. He is granted perhaps not safe passage, but it is spun by the gods that he shall be tested whether he is worthy of returning home. But it is also, if he accepts his fate, it is decreed right on the very first page of the book, of book 1 of the Odyssey, that Zeus agrees with Athena that he must return home. And as we learn later in the text, that the so-called suitors in Ithaca who are trying to take away his kingdom from him and marry his wife, Penelope, that they shall remain empty-handed. So from the beginning, the very text, we know that Odysseus is the darling of the gods, and he never, not once, is in defiance of the gods. But we must understand this, let's say, subtitle, Defy the Gods, as an attack on polytheism, on paganism, on heathenism. It is an attack on the pantheon, no less, by that one very jealous God who assumes for himself his sole power, who doesn't allow any gods next to him, who deems them to be idols. That is the subliminal message that is incepted into the minds of the masses, the cattle, the masses who watch that movie, who watch it just as any other Marvel superhero movie. That is the message they will take home, even if they don't know it. So, Odysseus, responds to that misclaim here that he will defy the gods and return home. So, the return home, which is divine foreseeing, vision, which is a divine fate spun by the gods themselves for their darling Odysseus. And yes, there are issues with Poseidon, I know, but still, Zeus and Athena, for example, want him to return home, but he has to be tested along the way to make sure that he is indeed worthy of return. That is the story of the Odyssey. This very story is subverted here into a story of supposedly human agency over cosmic forces. That's how reviewers have framed this. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that in defiance of the gods, in defiance of the pantheons, in defiance of the very beginning of Greek thinking, the monotheistic God gets to rule over the earth. And hence why I said in the previous video, it's the most so-called, let's say, conservative video, by which I just meant that conservative pundits are in favor of it for that very reason. And they do recognize something, which is that it is indeed a Trojan horse for Judeo-Christian ethics and values. So it is a deconstructive movie. It deconstructs the heroic figure, and it deconstructs also the divine of the pantheon and replaces it not with human agency, but in fact with an abstract monotheos. So here, key elements of, let's say, Christian themes. Xenia, the sacred law of hospitality, is reinterpreted as the golden rule. So in Homer's epic, the Odyssey, Xenia, that law of hospitality, is not a social contract, but it is the very foundation upon which Greek culture builds itself. It's the very foundation for paideia. It's what we inherit from the Greeks. And everyone must enforce it. You will have all heard of the myth of Philemon and Baucis, who are the only ones who uphold Xenia. We learn of their story in Ovid's Metamorphosis, for example. And hence, when Zeus and Hermes go to visit mortals and get to see whether they actually uphold Xenia, they are the only ones who do so, and hence they are spared judgment and death and destruction. But in the Odyssey, in Homer's Odyssey, Xenia is either upheld, for example, by Nausicaa and the Phoenicians at the Phaeacians at beginning in Book 6. To some extent, even it's upheld by Calypso. It is not upheld by Polyphemus, the Cyclops, who is blinded by Odysseus and his men in order so they can escape. But he brings it upon himself because he doesn't uphold Xenia. But Xenia isn't what it is reinterpreted as in the movie, which is Jesus' let's say, golden rule from the Gospels. Treat strangers as you would be treated yourself, which we find in Matthew. So here, hospitality is reframed as active love and charity towards the vulnerable traveler and the stranger. And Nolan said something to that effect as well. Xenia always needs two parties, however. The host and the guest. So it is, in fact, that is one of the main sort of subversions, aside from the defiance of the gods, which we do not find at all in Homer's Odyssey. Perhaps even more importantly, we find Christianized concepts of guilt and remorse in Nolan's Odyssey, in Nolan's adaptation of Homer's Odyssey, which is very un-Greek. There's no sin, there is no guilt, and there is no remorse. Now, if you think of yourself as perhaps not Christian, but still you look at the world in terms of sin and who is guilty and who should have remorse, then you might be more Christian than you will be aware. What Odysseus is driven by is kleos, glory, fame. So when Odysseus meets Achilles in Hades, very often that passage gets brutally misinterpreted. When Achilles says that if only he could live perhaps again, even as just a servant, so that he may see the sun again, or that he may just see life again, then he would do this. And this is usually taken as him forfeiting, as sort of forsaking rather his heroic life before. He'd rather return as a non-hero. He would never have liked to be a hero. That's nonsense. Is it, if anyone reads it like this, just shows themselves to be incapable of reading. Because what Achilles really inquires into from Odysseus is, how is my son doing? Is he a glorious warrior as I was? Is he full of rage and anger? Is he capable of slaying, of killing worthy, honorable enemies? And how is my father doing? Is he still on the battlefield? That is what he inquires into, because through his blood, his memory will be kept alive, and he will be truly immortal in his kleos, in his glory and fame through that. That is what matters to the Greek hero. And as such a hero, they become, Odysseus, and much more so perhaps Achilles and Ajax, they become measures for man, measures to live by. And I should point out as well that Odysseus, yes, he fails to take home his crew. Why is that? Because they are in defiance of the gods. They kill Helios's cattle on his island, and hence they are punished. Hence they are not allowed to return, and because they are in defiance of the gods, they're not allowed to return. They follow their base instincts, their base desires, wanting to eat something, and hence they are punished by the gods, and so they show themselves unworthy of returning home. But in Nolan's The Odyssey, or what's left of it, Odysseus, Matt Damon, is plagued by a bad conscience. And crudely enough, that bad conscience is very often depicted as so-called Athena, a frowning, let's be honest, ugly Athena. So this is distinctly a Judeo-Christian bad conscience. That's also at the same time very personal, something else that the Greeks didn't know. Yes, Odysseus is described as much suffering or long suffering, but he takes that suffering, he accepts that suffering as a condition of life and affirms it. He doesn't feel remorse, and he certainly doesn't feel guilty for his time at war. So the Trojan horse becomes a sin, the original sin even. So it is not a glorification of his metis, of his cunning. And at the same time, it is no longer, which is another reading of it, a force for enculturization, for civilization, because finally the war is over. And let's not forget that the horse, the Trojan horse, was in fact dedicated as a gift to Athena. Context does matter. So no, Odysseus now, that fake Odysseus, that Christianized Odysseus of Nolan, shows deep remorse, guilt, constant bad conscience. He laments his cunning, what makes him heroic in the first place. So the entire story gets corrupted from a man of strong cunning and rhetorical capacity to great wisdom, which is what he becomes in the end, because, to speak with Hegel, because he faces death. So he lives the life of spirit and faces death and negativity head on. Hence, and he, in fact, as Circe points out to him, he dies twice. When he goes to Hades and then will have to die later on. So he is, in a sense, the hero's hero. None of this here, because here we have a guilt-ridden Odysseus who laments that turning a sacred peace offering into a weapon violated fundamental human rights. So he's traumatized, and that is a penance for him. He's punished by it, and his decade-long struggle to reach home acts, of course, as a spiritual dark night of the soul. He's a soul-searching, traumatized warrior. He's in a sort of purgatory, and he has to be cleansed. So his journey becomes a purgatory, and he suffers for his hubris and his war crimes. Odysseus is not, in fact, of hubris at all, because he doesn't defy the gods. He stays within what is of man, and hence he is not in any way to be blamed for hubris. Again, it would be un-Greek to assume that he is, in that sense, of hubris. He can't be blamed for that at all. And so, I mean, if that weren't enough, Nolan's arc at the end leans into a Christian typology of redemption through surrender. So before he finally is allowed to return home in Nolan's adaptation, maladaptation perhaps I should say, Odysseus undergoes a moment of symbolic baptism, a sort of cathartic, a cleansing, a catharsis, where he sheds his pride, which makes him heroic in the first place, and takes responsibility for the lost lives of his crew. But as I said before, his crew show themselves to be unworthy of return. Now you might find that inhumane. You might think that that is cruel and just simply unbelievable. But then again, you might want to attend Mass more often, because you show yourself to be Christian, even if you're not even baptized. You see, I've come to the conclusion that liberalism isn't the secularization of Christianity, it is its secular arm of that particular morality. So Odysseus at the end here turns or shifts from a warrior rather to a man who is humbled by his limitations. Now, this is this redemption arc at the end is the cherry on top, and I would just like to urge you to see how deeply subversive this movie ultimately is, which is why this is, in fact, one of the most conservative movies of the past decade, because it turns one of the greatest heroes into a Judeo-Christian beast of morality, a defender of that particular moral order. So the Greek world never appears. And it would have, in fact, been better not to watch the movie if you've seen it and you haven't got any grounding in Greek mythology, because now you'll walk away from it thinking that you know anything about it, and you don't. So I would urge you, if you're really keen to learn anything about it, to read the Odyssey for yourself in a good translation. For example, Richmond Lattimore's translation, or at least Fagel's translation, or Mary's translation if you're reading English. It is not a Christian story. Christianity shows itself to be extremely alien to that era, to that epoch. There's nothing that combines or connects the Homeric epics to the Bible. We can try and violate the text and try and bring certain things together that shouldn't belong together, but you see, association can go to any length to pretend that certain things belong together when they don't. But here, of course, what we have is the ultimate Judeo-Christian story arc in a Greek bodysuit. So thank you very much for listening. And if you'd like to learn more about philosophy, follow the link in the description of this video and take one of my courses at the Halcyon Academy and learn to think. Sapere aude, my friends. Thank you.